Would the congregation please be seated? It is surprising to me that my little town of Essex, Massachusetts, chooses to work on roads during the busiest time of the year. You see, I live in this little village of 2,500 people on the North Shore in Massachusetts that receives an influx of visitors during the summer months. They come for the beaches, and they come for the fried clams and for the scenic vistas. The town itself is not much more than a couple intersections and a series of cute shops and restaurants that mirror the tidal river on which our town flows. And so, in the middle of June, we started to notice things happening. And by July 1st, just before the 4th of July weekend, well, you know what happened. The town decided to tackle replacing the sidewalks and repaving much of the town center. In the least surprising outcome ever, this has thrown the town traffic and parking and pedestrian flow completely out the window and brought with it an enormous amount of frustration. One of the things that I live on a little house on Main Street, and we often see out-of-towners circling with perplexed looks on their faces. And then the second time, it's anger. And then the third time, they just peel off into the distance. Maybe the town heard about these challenges. Maybe they heard from the restaurants and shops, and maybe they heard from visitors, but they've responded in a way that towns often do with an enormous amount of signs. The signs they've employed are of every single variety you can imagine. Outside of town, on the edges of town, are those big blinking highway ones, you know? Construction zone ahead. And then as you come into town, there's a series of smaller signs and poster-size signs and handbill-size signs. And the restaurants and the shops have added their own signs, parking available or open during construction this way. Well, there are just signs everywhere. We count on signs to point us in the right direction. And signs provide guidance for unknown situations. And we anticipate clarity and expect consistency in signs. But this does not mean that signs work at all. In fact, signs are always open for misinterpretation. And when we misinterpret or ignore signs, they send us in a direction we don't want to go, or perhaps shouldn't go. You see, signs are only as good as our ability to see them and to understand them and to take them seriously. And one of the things that I've noticed about all of these signs in my village is that there are ways in which people can see the signs and then not see the signs. For example, yesterday, there was a beautiful truck pulling one of those long Airstream trailers stuck at the end of a dead-end road. And I was out running, and so I stopped and helped the man turn the truck around, and I said, "How did you get here?" And he said, "My GPS sent me this way." Even though there were signs that said, "Dead end ahead, no further, no trailers," there he was. Another group of people that are frustrated by these signs are the people who live in town and have lived there for 50 years. They know how to get places. Despite the signs and the changing one-way traffic, well, you can imagine, they know how to go. Signs be damned. This has resulted in horns beeping, and angry small-town Facebook posts. It's exactly what you would expect. All of these signs and our inability to see them. This morning's gospel, maybe you see where I'm going. Do you see where I'm going? Is about signs and about the challenge we have in seeing the signs and what happens when we misinterpret them. Throughout the Gospel of John, the followers of Jesus see signs. And in fact, the author of the Gospel of John is so specific that he uses these signs, very specific signs, to point to something important, to tell the story. These signs that John uses, he doesn't call them miracles. He very specifically calls them signs in the Gospel of John. These signs do something very important for the people who are seeing them, who are reading them, and that is they point to the divinity of Jesus. These signs are some that you probably are familiar with. They include Jesus' first miracle, the sign where he turns water to wine. In the Gospel of John, there's also 2 healings that make up these signs. There's the story of Jesus walking on water. There's raising Lazarus from the dead. But the fourth sign is the one that we had appointed for last week's gospel and forms the basis of the next 3 weeks of preaching. For any of you who are carb conscious, the next 3 weeks in church are going to be very difficult. All of the lectionary is about bread. Bread, 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 and more bread. It began last week where Jesus fed the 5,000 there on the edge of the sea, using the gifts brought by that child of bread and fish. This miraculous story kicks off what we call the bread discourse. The reason why we have it for 4 weeks is because Jesus knows what we know, that seeing and interpreting signs is not always easy. And so we've been given this opportunity to really dig into this sign, this bread, and what it is pointing to. The crowds have arrived in Capernaum, which is a city on the edge of the sea where Jesus has landed after feeding the 5,000 the day before. If you remember, he leaves in the middle of the night and follows the disciples who leave their boat and travel through the wind and the rain and walks on the water to the other side of the sea. And so as these people wake up the next morning, they ask a very reasonable question, which is, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" And Jesus' response presupposes their intention behind their question, and he says, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate the fill of the loaves." Why are the people looking for Jesus? They're hungry. They are looking for bread to eat. What we know about this beautiful story is that the child gave them these loaves and fishes, this small amount, and Jesus broke it and blessed it, and his disciples shared it with the crowd, and so much so that how many baskets were left over? 12. 12 baskets of food, and so all of those people sleeping on the seaside woke up in the morning rubbing their bellies saying, "Where's those extras?" And so they follow him around the other side of the sea, and they're looking for Jesus to provide that physical food. And Jesus does do that. But Jesus wants them to understand that he offers a different kind of food, the kind that feeds the soul too. You see, they've seen the sign, but they've missed what it means. And they're on the way to making a turn onto a dead end, right? And so Jesus comes back around and he offers them another way of interpreting the sign. They are smart enough to wonder, and they say to him, "What sign are you going to give us, Jesus, so that we may see it and believe in you?" The example of the kind of sign that they're looking for is the variety of manna in the wilderness that their ancestors experienced. They were starving there. Remember that story? John just read it. They're starving there, and Moses, my favorite part about that story is they're complaining. I love it. They're complaining, and so Moses cries out to God and said, God, what should I do? And all of a sudden there's manna, this bread for them to eat. They were starving, and Moses gives them something to eat. Can you do this, Jesus? They seem to ask. And Jesus' response is meant to guide them into the right interpretation of the sign. He says, it wasn't Moses that gave them the bread, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Give us this bread, they say. I am the bread of life, Jesus said. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This is the sign. This table where we break bread together is the sign. The sign is that they're given is meant to transform their understanding of who Jesus is for them, and it's meant as a sign for who Jesus is for us. It's a meal that will feed them not just for their stomachs, but also their souls. The sign. Construction, the other thing that I know about it, is that it always takes longer than we expect. When they put up those big blinking signs on the 1st of July, they added the very hopeful expectation that it would take 3 weeks. 6 weeks later, and we're still running into each other. And the signs have increased. The construction continues. And the signs will be there. And our work is to understand them. One of the gifts of the church is that it provides signs for us. Today, you are going to experience 2 signs. We call these sacraments. Sacraments are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. Sacraments are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. That means that we use visible things. In the case of baptism, water. In the case of the Eucharist, bread and wine, to symbolize transformation. These outward and visible signs are meant to direct us to something deeper, something better, something transformative, something that keeps us going in the right direction, helps us from getting lost, and decreases frustration. And so, yes, I'm preaching about signs, but I'm preaching about sacraments. And I'm preaching about the possibility that all of us have to receive these things, to see these outward and visible signs, and to receive them as an internal spiritual grace. The opportunity we all have in this space is to see it, to really see it, and to follow clearly their directions. It's my greatest hope now that as we baptize the newest member of this church, that you will see this sign. And so as soon as he makes it back inside, we will begin our baptismal service.